Thank you all so much for coming tonight. My name is Sydney, and I am a winter naturalist and educator here at Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. And yeah, thank you guys so much for coming here tonight. Each winter, ACES partners with Wilderness Workshop and the Roaring Fork Audubon to co-host Naturalist Nights, which is a free winter speaker series. And this features experts from all across the country who explore different topics of the natural world with our community. We would first like to thank a lot of our sponsors. These businesses provide financial and in-kind donations that make Naturalist Nights possible, including the cookies and tea that you guys are enjoying tonight. I'd also like to do a special thank you to our tonight's featured gold sponsor, Reese Henry. We are recording tonight's presentation, so there will be a cleaned up recording that will be made available on the ACES and Wilderness Workshop YouTube channel in the coming days. And we also hope you will join us here next week on Wednesday for a Potbelly Perspective. And this one is titled Flavor Hunter, where great flavor emerges. And that one is with Barclay Dodge. And in 2 weeks, our next Naturalist Night, the talk is titled Life After Deadpool, Lake Powell's Last Days and the Rebirth of the Colorado River with Zach Podmore. This topic that we're going to be learning a lot more tonight I'm really excited for, and it has a lot of personal significance to me because I grew up in Colorado, so I did a bunch of hiking and backpacking all around the really, complex and beautiful forests here in this state. But I never really learned the names of the trees that made up these forests. And that changed a lot when I came here last June to start my job here as a naturalist. And I was able to start to, learn the names of these trees and learn about their attributes and their little quirks and kind of, their management plans as well. And that really helped me form a sense of belonging. Excuse me. A sense of belonging and place here. And I'm just really excited to learn more about these forests tonight. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our tonight's speaker, Dr. Miranda Redmond. Dr. Miranda Redmond is a forest ecologist whose research explores how climate change and disturbances shape forest and woodland ecosystems to develop ecologically sound and culturally informed management practices. Her research has been published in various renowned journals, including the Nature Climate Change, Global Change Biology, and the Journal of Ecology. She is an associate professor of forest science and climate change in the Department of Environmental Policy, Science and Management at UC Berkeley, where she teaches forest ecology and silviculture, mentoring students in ecosystem science and applied forest ecology. So we're about to start the presentation. Before that, just a reminder to please silence all devices and remember to hold your questions until the end of the presentation where we will hold a brief Q&A session. And with that, thank you all so much and please welcome Dr. Redmond.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. And yeah, it's really an honor to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about the ecology and resilience of Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands under ever-changing conditions. And these ecosystems are near and dear to my heart, and I'm really happy to be here to chat about them with you all. So I'm first going to give a little bit of an introduction and kind of overview to these woodlands and discuss some of their kind of past and present dynamics. Then we'll discuss some of the vulnerability that these ecosystems face due to global change pressures. And lastly, end with how to manage these ecosystems for their resilience to drought and as part of that, kind of ongoing stewardship and research efforts. So Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands are widespread here in the Roaring Fork Valley, but also widespread across the southwestern US. And this map on the right here shows the distribution of various different pinyon species that comprise these woodlands, with here in the kind of Four Corners state, so including here, we have two-needle pinyon pine. That is the dominant pinyon pine species here. And then these woodlands are also comprised of various juniper species, with kind of one-seed juniper being really dominant in the southeastern portion of its range, and Utah juniper being prevalent in kind of the rest of the range. And one thing that I want to bring up here is this vegetation type is vast. It spans over 55 million acres, and it spans a broad climatic and soil gradient. And on this map here, you can see the proportion of monsoonal precipitation, or in other words, precipitation that falls during summer relative to winter. And in the southeast portion of the range, so kind of southeastern New Mexico, you can see there's a lot, really high levels of summer monsoonal precipitation, so upwards of 60%, whereas in the northwest portions of its range, there's substantially less summer precipitation. And not only are these woodlands really widespread spatially, but they also comprise the largest amounts of mature and old growth forests remaining in the western US, so over 10 million hectares. And these old growth forests can take many forms, some that are more exclusively dominated by pinyon pine, others that are more exclusively dominated by juniper, and a wide variety in terms of what the understory vegetation composition look like. But kind of in all of these old growth forests, you'll often see these kind of almost gnarly looking trees in terms of, really twisted trunks and branches. And I had the pleasure of hiking up at Red Hill outside of Carbondale yesterday and got to see beautiful old growth pinyon-juniper forests here. And these woodland ecosystems are kind of also kind of diverse in terms of the topographic conditions that they occupy. So this is a photo taken in Mesa Verde National Park, and they occupy on mesa tops, down into canyons. They're often found in shallow soils with exposed bedrock, as depicted here. This is a photo taken in a pinyon-juniper woodland outside of Dolores, Colorado. And they also can have very limited understory vegetation. And I definitely noticed that in the woodlands outside of the woodlands on Red Hill outside of Carbondale. And they also often have biological soil crusts, and these biological soil crusts are really important for stabilizing the soil. They also fix nitrogen and have kind of a suite of organisms that form and can take actually centuries to really build these really deep crusts. And because of both biological soil crusts, exposed bedrock, and then in some areas just soil types that don't support a lot of understory vegetation, these woodlands often have really limited surface fuels. And that has really limited fire spread in these ecosystems, resulting in really long fire return intervals, so on the order of 300 plus years. So it's really different than like the ponderosa pine forests that we see that were really adapted for frequent fire. Ponderosa pine has thick bark, high branches that really helps it survive kind of surface fires, whereas pinyon pine often has branches that go much lower to the ground. It has thin bark and is much more sensitive to fire. In other areas where pinyon-juniper occur, they do occur in some places with kind of deeper, more productive soils, as shown here, and especially in areas with much more monsoonal precipitation. And in some areas in kind of this woodland type, studies have found some evidence of frequent burning in the past. This was particularly in eastern New Mexico, where there was enough fuel to kind of carry fires in that system. And in other areas, such as parts of western Colorado and the Great Basin, where it's more dominated by winter precipitation, you often see sagebrush intermixed with pinyon-juniper woodlands, kind of forming this mosaic. And I actually saw that on Red Hill as well, where there is this kind of area of a sagebrush-dominated section that was bordered by these old-growth pinyon-juniper forests. And so they'll often have this mosaic pattern on the landscape. And because these ecosystems are so diverse, there's been a really broad effort to try to kind of generally classify these woodlands based off their dynamics. And this is a figure by a paper written by Bill Rami and others, where they classified these woodlands into kind of 3 broad general categorizations. So one was that kind of savanna type ecosystem that I introduced earlier, where there's that high grass cover, low tree density. And this is, as I mentioned, really common in eastern New Mexico. And in this woodland type, their surface fire can be common here because of that ability to spread fire. In contrast, in persistent woodlands, which is like the woodlands I've seen around here, they tend to be more consistently tree dominated. There tends to be greater water availability relative to the savanna type. And they're especially common in the Colorado Plateau region. And as I mentioned, this is where we tend to have long fire return intervals due to surface fuel limitations. And then the last one to mention is what's called wooded shrublands. And really the kind of idea behind this nomenclature is that this type is dynamic, where you might have a really dominated, kind of tree-dominated woodland, but then during periods of poor climate conditions in the past or following a disturbance, it's then shrub dominated for a while and kind of really fluctuates between. So its dominance really waxes and wanes due to kind of patch scale disturbances. So a small fire or kind of a small patch of drought or beetle infestation that then shrubs then become more dominant, and then over time, trees become more dominant. And today I'm really going to be focusing on persistent woodlands and wooded shrublands, as that's the kind of pinyon-juniper forest type I work the most in, and that's prevalent around the valley. The other thing that I want to mention about these woodlands is that they're really structurally complex. So they tend to be pretty spatially heterogeneous, where this is just an image I took off of Google Earth looking down at a random Pinyon-Juniper woodland. And, I want to point out, this patch here of this kind of opening. Then you have these more kind of continuous woodlands, but still with some smaller openings, and then some more clumps of trees. And so it's very patchy, structurally. And the other key thing is that it also tends to be really multi-aged. So pinyon pine and juniper, they are fairly shade tolerant in that, especially pinyon pine, they often establish beneath the understory of an overstory tree or a shrub. And so when you walk into these woodlands, you'll often see overstory trees, but also younger trees, kind of as depicted here. So they have this multi-aged structure. And then the other thing, I don't have a photo to illustrate this, but I actually also saw this a lot out at Red Hill, is there's often a lot of snags and logs, some trees that had died in the past, logs on the ground, that also really create important habitat for wildlife. And then the other thing I just want to highlight with these woodlands, obviously, I think they're awesome. And they support a diversity of species because of that structural complexity and the habitat that they provide. And this can be, from birds to small mammals to insects and reptiles, as well as various herbaceous species, especially in those, openings. They've also been used for a variety and are used for a variety of purposes. So they are important range systems in the western US and are commonly grazed by cattle. And these woodlands are culturally important to many Indigenous tribes across the region who have stewarded these ecosystems since time immemorial and are still stewarding these woodlands today in many areas. And they produce these really delicious pine nuts that are gathered annually and are culturally important as well. And I wanted to take a moment to share a little bit about pinyon cone production and pine nut production, just because it's kind of a unique feature of these woodlands in that pinyon pine produces these pretty large pine nuts that are edible. If you go on this, if you kind of walk through, I don't know, Santa Fe in the fall during a big pine nut year, you'll often see pine nuts being sold. And so they're kind of valued both by people and especially by Indigenous people. And then they're also really important in terms of providing an important food source for wildlife. And one thing about pinyon pine nut production is that it's highly temporally variable. So if you have a stand of pine trees, all the trees in that stand tend to produce a lot of pine cones and pine nuts one year, and then don't for several years. And this is a pattern known as masting or mast seeding, where it's this really synchronous seed production and with high interannual variability. And so that's what I'm kind of depicting here on this graph. I can't remember where I pulled these data from, but they were from some site that I sampled cone production from in two-needle pinyon pine. We have, these years of high abundance and then years of really low cone production. And this is often thought to be really an evolved strategy to help keep seed predator populations low. So if you don't produce for a few years, your seed predator populations aren't going to get really big. They're going to be limited because there's not a ton of pine nuts. But then if you produce a lot one year, then okay, great. The seed predators can eat the seeds that they can eat, but there'll be enough to allow that species, to allow that population to regenerate. And so that's one kind of mechanism or kind of evolved mechanism by which this masting pattern has developed. And it's something that we really see in pinyon pine. And what we tend to see is, in some of, okay, there we go. And a lot of my work in studying pinyon cone production has been using what's called this cone scar method, where we can actually use branch morphology to reconstruct cone production going back in time about 10 to 15 years. So basically, we can look for, it's hard to visually show it, but we can look for these little bud scale scars on these branches that show how much it grew each year. And we can then date the branches that way. And then we can also search for little cone scars. And by doing that, we can reconstruct patterns of cone production over time. And what we've found from this is that we tend to see that these really large cone years, so these big mass years, really tend to occur when climate conditions were cool and wet during cone initiation, which is actually 2 years prior to mature cone production, as well as pollen. So that's the summer 2 years prior to cone initiation, as well as pollination, which is the spring 1 year prior. And this will often, because of this kind of strong relationship between climate and cone production, you'll tend to see these synchronized areas, here as well as in Dolores, having similar patterns of masting because of similar patterns in climate conditions over time. And I could talk about pinyon comb production all day, but I'm trying to keep this talk broader. So always happy to chat after, or if you have questions about it, happy to chat more. The other kind of last thing that I wanted to bring up in terms of thinking about these pinyon-juniper woodlands is that they're really temporally dynamic. And so climate has played, meaning that their distribution and abundance has varied over time, over thousands of years. And this is partially shaped by climate. So climate's really played a major role in that distribution and structure of these woodlands. So for example, cool and wet conditions really tend to promote tree establishment. Pinyon pines growing in these pretty water limited conditions. And so we tend to see higher establishment, particularly of pinyon pine during cool climate conditions, such as in the kind of very early 1900s, there was a pulse of establishment following cool and wet conditions. We also, the other kind of role that climate's played is it's also contributed to tree die-off events in the past. There was the 1500s mega drought that resulted in tree die-off, and then in other areas, particularly more northward, near the northern kind of portion of its range, you can have pinyon populations that are relatively newly established because they have slowly been marching northward post-glaciation. And I just think this is important to keep in mind that there's no like static condition of what a given area should be, because it's dynamic. And they're also temporally dynamic due to humans. So as I mentioned, these woodlands have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial, and then in addition, we've kind of since Euro-American settlement, there was a lot of harvesting in the 19th century, so kind of the late 1800s time period. In certain places, by no means in all places. Otherwise, we wouldn't have old growth. And just to highlight how in some areas, how extensive this was, this is a map of Nevada. So, very different part of the country compared to here, and where mining operations were really prevalent. And this is where there's been some extensive harvesting that was documented for building materials, but also for charcoal production for these mining operations, because the charcoal was needed for melting or for smelting ore. And so the map on the right here, it's kind of hard to see, but the little white dots shows areas where these charcoal pit locations have been identified. And there's likely many more that just haven't been identified yet. And the picture on the left here is where is an unburned wood pile that was, piled for forming these charcoal pits for smelting ore, but wasn't actually burned. You might think, okay, it's not that big of a pile. At least that's what I thought when I first saw this picture, until you realize that this right here is a person standing there. So it's actually really substantial. Yeah. That picture is Peter Weisberg, he's a professor at University of Nevada, Reno, and he's done a lot of work mapping these locations. And I was actually in the field once with him. And again, this is really Nevada prevalent, but I still like sharing about it just for context. But I was in the field once with him, and we were walking, and there was this, little mound of dirt. Not very big. I wouldn't have thought twice about it. And he was like, I think this was a charcoal pit location. And sure enough, we dug down and saw the kind of black evidence of it having prior been used for charcoal. There's definitely more examples of this harvesting in the 19th century in Nevada. There are also some other examples in other portions of Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands range. So this image is from a study that we did in southeast Colorado, where we used General Land Office survey data from the 1860s. And we found that over 50% of what was classified then as kind of dense woodlands, or how it was stated in the records was like, I entered a thicket of cedar or a thicket of woodland. Cedar is what juniper was often called. And we found that over 50% of these kind of historically dense woodlands are now treeless or had very little trees. And this was really because due to a kind of wood cutting that happened during early settlement and kind of efforts to kind of cultivate the land. So there's kind of a long history of use of these woodlands that until you dig deep, you might not readily see on the landscape. Other human-caused impacts are, fire suppression, which is really mostly prevalent in those pinyon-juniper savannas that burned frequently, but also may have limited the abundance of these kind of patch-scale openings that maybe would have occurred in other areas. Grazing is another, major, like grazing by cows in particular is another kind of major agent of change in these systems that, alters soil properties and understory vegetation dynamics. And along that vein, invasive species is another huge player, and I'll get into that in a little bit in terms of the role that cheatgrass has played in affecting these ecosystems' resilience. And then lastly, I'll mention kind of tree removal treatments more in the 20th century, so the last, in the 1900s really. And as part of that, there's in the 20th century, so probably around like 1930 or so, there's been a lot of repeat photography that was done, where there is a photo that was taken in this image, it was 1909, and you can see pictures like this in many different areas of Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands that were then, re-photographed later. And what oftentimes those have shown are this increase in tree density and expansion of pinyon and juniper woodlands since the early 1900s. And that's really due to a whole suite of various factors. So those cool and wet climate conditions that I mentioned, recovery from past disturbances, so past fire, or past drought, as well as, that 19th century harvesting. That's really, shaped these 20th century dynamics. And partly because of that, a lot of federal agency management focused on tree removal in the 20th century. And initially, like in the 1950s and 60s, that was really, that management was I think the major management action that was used was chaining, where, this Eli chain, as kind of depicted here, was dragged across the surface and effectively toppled over the trees. And you can imagine that can really change the structure in those systems. Oftentimes they were also seeded with crested wheatgrass, which is a non-native plant that is still then present in a lot of these areas. And so really all of, if we think about all of these temporal dynamics and all of these, past land management and past other disturbances, and then the spatial variability in terms of climate and soils and topography that these woodlands inhabit, there's then a really big diversity in woodland structure and composition across the landscape. We definitely have a fair amount of old growth Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, but we also have a lot of second growth Pinyon-Juniper woodlands that are these younger, less than 100 or 150-year-old stands that that are present due to kind of more recent, more recent's hard to say, but 100 years ago management. And so I want to kind of pivot to then thinking about the climate vulnerability of these systems, and the need for and how to manage for woodland resilience. So this image is a picture of a wildfire that occurred. This was in the Pine Nut Mountains in Nevada, kind of western Nevada area. And it occurred predominantly in these kind of second growth, in these Pinyon-Juniper woodlands that were cut in the early 1900s. And so they weren't old growth woodlands. But you can see how kind of devastating this fire was in terms of this woodland. And it was, devastating for the landscape and devastating for the people who use this landscape. And especially this is the Washoe tribe uses these woodlands a lot for pine nut collection, and just really devastating in terms of the loss of these woodlands. And we're seeing kind of increasingly these large stand replacing fires. And when this occurs, recovery is going to be really limited because pinyon pine produces those large seeds. They're not getting dispersed by wind. And so in the absence of kind of active reforestation, recovery is going to be really slow, on the order of hundreds of years. You definitely do have animals that are going to be, pinyon jays that can disperse those seeds, but the time it would take to actually get enough seedlings in the ground would be a long time if you waited for natural regeneration. And then on top of that, in some areas, there's been drought-related tree die-off. So this really came to the forefront in the early 2000s, where there was a multi-year drought coupled with pinyon infestations. That's a bark beetle that attacks pinyon trees. That resulted in really high levels of mortality in some areas, particularly in the Four Corners region. So when I look out at, when I was hiking at Red Hill, I was amazed at how healthy all the pinyon trees looked, and I didn't see evidence of, past mortality from the early 2000s drought. But that's really different compared to when I go into the Cortez and Dolores area, where there's a lot of evidence of this past mortality. And even in that, this was taken, in a Pinyon-Juniper woodland outside of Dolores. There's then still been some kind of subsequent mortality that's occurred. So this was, these trees are dying from the 2018, or died from the 2018 drought. The other thing I want to point out here is the cheatgrass in the foreground, which is also a major concern. And then we see in some areas that didn't experience this punctuated die-off, or maybe did, but there's still remaining trees. We're still seeing some continued kind of die-off and die-back, and just stressed-looking trees. And again, this is not the case across all of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. Like here in Roaring Fork Valley, they look really healthy. But in other portions, we're definitely seeing some substantial dieback and mortality. I've done a lot of my work has been looking for baby trees across the landscape and seeing what kind of where tree regeneration and recovery tends to occur and where it doesn't. And one thing that's really awesome about these woodlands is because they're they tend to be multi-age, where there's juveniles, there tends to be juveniles that are established underneath, is that in a lot of areas where there has been mortality, there's still juveniles that remaining, where the mortality really occurred among the overstory trees. But the juveniles that were there were able to survive that drought event and are continuing to grow. So that is, I think, really promising and really great for these areas that experience that drought-related mortality. Fire, of course, would kill those juvenile trees. But in the case of these kind of drought-related mortality and dieback, we do see kind of substantial advanced regeneration in many areas. In areas where there tends to be pretty limited new seedling establishment, so trees that have established since the drought, just because the overstory trees are gone. So it's really relying on these, juveniles that are remaining. In dry areas, kind of in the hottest and driest portions of Pines Range, we're often seeing some regeneration failure that's occurring, even among those kind of remaining juveniles. And the other thing that I want to bring up in the context of Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands is especially with pinyon pine, is they are really poor competitors against grasses, and whether, so if even like invasive grasses like treat grass, but also even native grasses. And on the flip side, are really facilitated by shrub species. So you'll often see pinyons that are establishing beneath the canopy of a shrub that's providing a little bit of a shaded microsite. It's a little cooler beneath that shrub. Shrubs sometimes can even like bring up soil moisture from deeper down into the soil towards the surface that can benefit these young seedlings. And so because of this, how these woodlands recover is often dependent on the understory vegetation response. It really can influence that overstory. And I want to be cognizant of time. And I think I'm just going to skip this. Well, I guess I'll say two things. So one, if we think of like how should these ecosystems to be managed to reduce the likelihood of drought and beetle-induced tree die-off events, I think that's a really big question that's on people's minds, particularly in the areas that are experiencing these die-offs. And one idea that's often proposed across forest systems is to thin the trees. So basically remove some of the trees so that way the remaining trees aren't competing for water and light with the other remaining trees. We really don't have evidence in Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands to support whether this is effective or not. And so like any thinning that like I'm very cautious about doing any sort of thinning in Pinyon-Juniper because we don't really have a lot of evidence to support this. And I think thinning that's done should be done in an experimental way and at a small scale to learn from it and grow, and especially the more intensive thinning treatments. And I think we definitely need experimental studies. We need, managers and researchers working together to try out new strategies in these woodlands. But we're not at a point knowledge-wise to support any sort of like thinning for woodland resilience at a broad scale. And the other, and I think that gets back to these trees are very slow growing and are ecological and cultural keystone species. And so that's where a really cautious approach in my eyes is needed. And then the other thing that I'll mention with these woodlands is they're really different than a lot of systems in terms of oftentimes in these intact woodlands, we can have pretty sparse understory vegetation cover. And when you thin or remove a lot of the trees, you can get this influx of understory vegetation, and that can then increase the amount of fine fuels on the soil surface, which can actually sometimes increase fire behavior. So this was a study that relatively recently came out where they were doing these fuel treatments in these kind of Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands / sagebrush areas, and found that by kind of removing the pinyon trees, maybe was beneficial for promoting sagebrush and other understory species, but actually increased fire behavior. And so I think there is still really a lot to learn there in terms of whether and if any sort of kind of thinning treatments should be done in from a fire risk reduction standpoint. This is just a table from a paper that I have on this slide, really just to highlight the kind of low to moderate confidence we have in some of these treatments that are, getting at this kind of fire risk reduction or increasing the resilience to drought. And that's where collaboration and interdisciplinary efforts are really needed. I was going to share about a little project that we have to tackle some of these questions in Dolores, or outside of Dolores in a Pinyon-Juniper Woodland, to address some of these knowledge gaps. I'm gonna skip through that, I wanna make sure we have time for questions. So sorry, little teasers. And then I wanna end a little bit more positive, and that there's a lot of really exciting collaborative work that's happening. So actually that project that I skipped over, that's like this collaboration with a whole group of people at the BLM and then researchers at various different institutions to try to, implement some of these treatments in a very experimentally controlled fashion and learn from them. And then there's also a lot of really exciting work that's happening in the Eastern Sierras and Western Great Basin, where some of these, there's been some of this, fire-caused mortality and drought-related mortality that's happened. And kind of a whole group of different people have come together to form what's called the kind of Pinyon Community Climate Action Network. And this includes several different tribal nations, several different NGOs, various federal agency land managers and researchers to really come together and do more kind of community-oriented work. And so just to highlight some neat work that's happening, the Bishop Paiute tribe has really been a leader and developed this tribal citizen science woodland monitoring app, and they did this in kind of close collaboration with the BLM and Forest Service to really get people back out on the land, back reconnecting with the land, and also as a way to monitor woodland health, to identify areas for stewardship, to track changes in health and changes in comb production. This effort's really been kind of expanded over kind of through this network over the past year. So in just the past year, we have gotten 510 observations with 38 monitors, and kind of are learning from the data that's coming in. And Big Pine Paiute Tribe has also been doing a lot of these surveys as well, and putting a lot of community events together, again, to reconnect people with the land, in addition to growing out pinyon seedlings for reforesting areas. And from this kind of collective effort, and kind of all the issues that various different groups have faced in different regions in the kind of Eastern Sierras, Southern California, and Western Great Basin. There's been this kind of sharing of pinyon propagation and reforestation kind of best practices. Washoe Tribe Environmental Protection Department really took the lead on this initially because of that 2021 fire that I showed that image of, where they've been really actively learning how to grow out pinyon pine and reforest, because it's not a timber species. It's not a species that was like cultivated a lot in the greenhouse. And so there's been a huge learning process in terms of how to best store these seeds, cultivate these seeds, and then reforest. And so I do think it's really exciting because there's a lot of momentum, not just in that region that I mentioned, but also in the Colorado Plateau region to really improve the resilience of these systems and to reforest them, and a lot of kind of close community partnerships and collaboration. So with that, I'll just kind of end by saying these woodland ecosystems are really diverse, and that they're also facing threats in many areas. And there's this, need for collaboration and interdisciplinary efforts to really improve their resilience. And with that, I would love to take any questions, and I really thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Redmond. This is super, super informative. We can give another hand. So it looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. I just want to make sure that you can get speak into the mic, because we are recording this, so we can have people who are watching it. So any questions? Sweet.
Hi, thanks for that. Can you speak a little to the difference between bristlecone and pinyon? It's my understanding that bristlecone at one point in the past was as widely distributed as pinyon is today, but it may be tougher, more drought resistant. And if any of the reseeding efforts would consider using bristlecone, and if the seeds are edible as well.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and one that I am not going to be able to give you the best answer on, and that I haven't worked with bristlecone and haven't explored that. My understanding in terms of bristlecone pine's distribution is that it's occurring in much cooler areas than where pinyon pine is found. So I wouldn't think that bristlecone pine would be able to kind of occupy the the semi-arid, hotter areas that pinyon pine can. With that said, I haven't grown out bristlecone and planted them in those areas, so can't kind of speak to that in confidence. But just based off their distribution, I feel like bristlecone pine tends to be in areas that experience drought, but they're still colder relative to pinyon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As you were showing those images of that fire and talking about intentional reseeding efforts, I was, of course, thinking about the slope above Basalt, where the Lake Christine fire happened, which was a juniper forest for a long time and has been bare for quite a while. Some oak, I think, is coming in. I was wondering, with reseeding efforts, what is the timeline for a forest coming back? And if we were to engage in some of that kind of work down there, what kind of timeline could we expect to see trees up there again?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think, so I would say most reforestation post-fire efforts have been focused more on planting the pinyon seedlings, less so the direct seeding, although you can directly seed. You're just even more gambling with what the climate's going to be like the next year in terms of whether it's successful. But it's hard. Pinyon pine is really slow growing, and juniper. And so, like when I was up at Red Hill yesterday, those seedlings, I kind of aged roughly or measured roughly how much it grew in the last 10 years. So it was a seedling that was this tall, I want to say, and it had grown this much in the past 10 years. And the younger it is, the slower it grows, so it would take time. It's like you're thinking, I think planting efforts now are thinking about the generation in the future. And so I definitely don't think you would want to plant with the expectation that it's going to be like a forest or a woodland in your lifetime so much as like in your kids' or grandchildren's lifetime. It also, obviously, the growth rates are going to vary depending on the climate condition of the area. And I can't speak to that specific area, but still, like throughout the distribution, they're pretty slow growing. So it's not going to be, it's not like in 20 years you'll have this woodland.
You mentioned seed robbers and the massed events sort of fooling them. Can you list some of the seed robbers?
Yeah. So pinyon jays are one, Clark's nutcracker are another, and then small mammals as well. And I've done some pine nut collection, and it's and with pine nut collection, particularly for reforestation, which is what I've done, you need to time when you're collecting the pine cone so that the seeds are mature enough. But you also don't want to be too late because you're competing against the seed robbers, and it can be challenging. With that said, was it not this past fall, but the fall prior was a huge mast year in the Eastern Sierras and kind of Great Basin area. And there you could go out months later and there'd still be some seeds because of that mast year. But when you're in the years in between where it's kind of patchy where there are any seeds, it's kind of a battle.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between pinyon pines and juniper and how all of these events that you talked very well about how it's affecting pinyons are also affecting juniper and that relationship?
Yeah. Good question. And more of my research has focused on pinyon pine. So that's why my talk's pretty pinyon pine biased, I would say. But in terms of juniper is the kind of droughtier species relative to the two. So it tends to be less sensitive to drought than pinyon pine. It also does better at growing in the interspaces of trees and shrubs. So it's less reliant on these shrubs or overstory trees for establishment, probably because it's better able to handle drier conditions. And because of that, after a disturbance, we tend to see juniper establishing first. And then pinyon pine will tend to establish later. Once shrubs have really come back, once other juniper trees have come back, and pinyon pine can then, establish beneath them. In terms of their relationship with each other, it's interesting because I often see a juniper and a pinyon growing, side by side with each other. I think some of that is that, the overstory tree is initially kind of facilitating the establishment of the understory tree, of the tree that's in the understory. They do have different mycorrhizal associations. So juniper is reliant on what's called arbuscular mycorrhizae to help increase its access to water and nutrients, whereas pinyons ectomycorrhizae. So they don't have any sort of kind of facilitative or mutualistic relationship with each other there in terms of kind of mycorrhizae.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Redmond. That was really incredible. I do just
Thanks again, everybody.
I just have one more reminder. So our next Naturalist Night will be in 2 weeks on Wednesday, February 4th in Carbondale, and then Thursday, February 5th at Hallam Lake. So we hope to see you there. Thank you all so much for coming.